3 of the 7 personal egress air packs recovered from the Challenger wreckage had been manually activated. Not by accident, not by automated systems, by human hands, in the dark, during a 2-minute freefall toward the Atlantic Ocean. One of those packs, the one belonging to pilot Michael Smith, was switched on by mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, who was seated directly behind him. That single act tells you everything the official press releases did not. The crew of Challenger was alive, conscious, and aware of what was happening to them after the shuttle broke apart on January 28, 1986. What the recovery teams pulled from 65 feet of black Atlantic mud over the following months is one of the most suppressed, most devastating forensic stories in the history of American spaceflight. The public narrative of Challenger has always centered on the launch, the plume, the silence. What it has never fully confronted is what came after. The 2 minutes and 45 seconds between structural breakup and ocean impact, and the 3 months of classified underwater recovery work that followed. The crew cabin did not vaporize, it fell. And inside it, people were breathing, moving, and in at least one case trying to save the ship. The physical evidence recovered from the Atlantic floor does not allow for comfortable conclusions. It demands a reckoning with what NASA knew when they knew it, and what they chose not to say. 1. The 3 manually activated personal egress air packs remain the single most disturbing piece of physical evidence recovered from the wreckage. Each PEAP required a deliberate, conscious action to switch on, a pull and twist motion that simply could not occur by accident or structural force. Investigators confirmed that Onizuka activated Smith's pack, meaning crew members were not only alive but oriented enough to help one another in the seconds after breakup. 2. Michael Smith's cockpit seat contained multiple switches thrown into positions that were not part of any pre-launch or ascent checklist. These were manual overrides, attempts to restore electrical power to the flight deck. Engineers who analyzed the seat configuration concluded that Smith was actively working the controls during the freefall. He was not a passive victim. He was a pilot trying to fly a vehicle that no longer existed as a flyable machine. 3. The crew cabin itself did not explode or burn during the initial breakup. The reinforced aluminum shell was engineered to withstand enormous structural stress, and it did. It survived the aerodynamic forces that shredded the rest of the orbiter. That's why the cabin remained largely intact as it separated from the disintegrating vehicle and began its arc downward. The very engineering designed to protect the crew in an abort scenario became the container for their final minutes. 4. The freefall lasted approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds. At that altitude and trajectory, the cabin would have reached terminal velocity before impact. When it struck the Atlantic, the deceleration force was estimated at over 200 times the force of gravity. No human body, no seat harness, no helmet could survive 200 Gs. The cabin that had protected the crew through the fall was destroyed in the fraction of a second it took to hit the water. 5. NASA was aware within weeks of the disaster that the PEAP activations indicated crew survival after breakup. The agency did not disclose this publicly for months. When the Rogers Commission released its findings in June 1986, the PEAP evidence was included, but presented without emphasis. It wasn't until investigative journalists and aerospace analysts began parsing the technical appendices that the full implication, conscious crew members in freefall, entered public discourse. NASA's official position was that it withheld the information to protect the families. Several family members disputed that justification themselves. 6. The recovery operation was conducted under strict military security. The USS Preserver served as the primary recovery vessel, and all divers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements before entering the water. Side-scan sonar mapped a debris field spanning more than 400 square miles along the Florida coast. The sheer scale of the search meant recovery teams were working in rotating shifts for weeks before the crew cabin was finally located in March 1986. 7. The remains of the 7 astronauts were found still strapped into their flight seats. The seats had remained bolted to the cabin floor through both the breakup and the impact. a testament, forensic investigators noted, to the structural integrity of the restraint system. Because the cabin had maintained partial pressure during the descent, the condition of the remains was significantly better preserved than the external shuttle debris. That fact made the work of the medical examiners at Patrick Air Force Base both more efficient and more psychologically devastating. 8. The recovery divers were not prepared for what they found. NASA had no formal psychological support protocol in place for recovery teams in 1986. Several divers reported intrusive memories, sleep disturbances, and what would today be classified as acute stress reactions consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. Some refused to return to the water after their first dive. The Navy eventually rotated personnel more aggressively, but no structured mental health intervention was offered until years after the mission concluded. Multiple divers have spoken publicly about the lasting psychological cost of those weeks. 9. The remains of mission specialist Gregory Jarvis were found outside the main cabin structure. Jarvis had been seated on the mid-deck, and the water impact caused a hull breach directly adjacent to his position. Divers spent several additional days searching the surrounding silt to locate and recover him. His case illustrated the limits of even a structurally intact cabin. The violence of the final impact was sufficient to compromise the hull at specific stress points, regardless of how well it had held together during the fall. 10. A heavily damaged flight helmet recovered from the debris field showed signs of both mechanical crushing and thermal distortion. The cabin itself did not burn, but friction during the descent and the catastrophic compression of the impact left clear physical signatures on the protective gear. The helmet became a focal point in the internal investigation into crew survivability standards. Specifically, whether a different helmet design or a pressurized suit could have extended the window of survival. 11. And here's the thing. The emergency oxygen systems in several of the recovered peeps showed depletion levels inconsistent with the 2-minute 45-second freefall alone. Some units showed nearly 6 minutes of use. Investigators concluded the packs had likely been activated, or partially activated, while the shuttle was still on the pad or in the early seconds of ascent, suggesting the crew was experiencing significant physiological stress before the vehicle ever cleared the launch tower. The O-ring failure that doomed the mission had been visible as a smoke plume from the right solid rocket booster within seconds of ignition. 12. The operational instrumentation recorder, the shuttle's equivalent of a flight data recorder, was recovered near the crew remains. It had sustained severe water damage during the impact. Engineers at IBM spent weeks in a controlled drying process attempting to recover data from the magnetic tape. The recording ended abruptly at the moment of water impact, confirming that the cabin's electrical systems failed instantaneously upon contact with the Atlantic. There was no gradual shutdown. The data simply stopped. 13. Forensic identification of the 7 crew members required dental records and early-stage DNA analysis. In 1986, forensic DNA typing was less than 2 years old as a practical tool, and its application here was one of the first large-scale uses of the technology in a mass casualty investigation. The 2 months the remains spent in the deep-sea environment had caused significant biological changes, complicating the process. Every piece of biological evidence was handled under national security protocols, with access restricted to cleared personnel. 14. The recovery mission officially concluded on April 16, 1986. Not all remains could be individually identified. NASA made the decision to enter the unidentifiable biological material in a decommissioned Minuteman missile silo at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. The choice of a missile silo, a Cold War structure designed to house nuclear weapons, struck many observers as grimly ironic. The site was sealed, classified, and designated a permanent restricted area. It remains so today. Public reaction at the time was muted, largely because the decision wasn't widely publicized until years later. 15. The autopsy reports for all 7 crew members were classified and have never been fully released. NASA successfully defended against multiple Freedom of Information Act requests from news organizations throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, arguing that disclosure would cause undue harm to the families. The official cause of death listed for each crew member is undetermined impact trauma. The specific forensic findings, what the medical examiners at Patrick Air Force Base documented in detail, remain sealed. Several of the astronauts' families have stated publicly that they were never given full access to the reports. 16. A Navy underwater robot designated Gemini was deployed ahead of the human divers to conduct initial reconnaissance of the debris field. The ROV captured high-resolution video footage of the cabin floor, intact personal lockers, mission checklists, equipment that had survived both the fall and the impact. That footage was immediately classified. It has not been released in any form to the public. Its existence was confirmed in technical recovery documents, but its contents remain unknown outside of the agencies that reviewed it. 17. Among the personal effects recovered from the wreckage was a small container of school supplies packed by Krista McAuliffe for use during her planned in-orbit lessons. The container had been stored in a mid-deck locker partially shielded by the floor structure above it. Several items inside were found intact: pencils, index cards, a lesson plan. They were cataloged as evidence and later transferred to NASA's Artifact Archive. They have never been put on public display. 18. A wedding ring belonging to one of the crew members was found embedded in the flight deck control panel. The force of the water impact had driven the ring into the instrument housing, with enough energy to partially fuse it to the surrounding metal. Technicians used precision extraction tools to remove it without damaging the adjacent hardware, which was still needed for the accident investigation. The ring was returned to the astronaut's family. The specific crew member has never been publicly identified at the family's request. 19. The remains were transported from the recovery ships to shore in sealed containers draped with American flags. 7 hearses met the USS Preserver at Port Canaveral under military escort and a media blackout enforced by the Department of Defense. No photographs of the transfer were permitted. This was, by cost and logistical complexity, the largest forensic recovery operation in the history of the United States Navy, a designation that has never been formally challenged. 20. A mission patch from STS-51L was recovered from inside a sealed air pocket within a section of the fuselage. The nylon fabric had been protected from saltwater saturation by the trapped air and showed almost no degradation. It was one of the most visually intact artifacts pulled from the entire debris field. The patch is currently held in a restricted collection and has not been placed on public display. Its condition, according to the recovery logs, was described as essentially new. 21. In 2022, a film crew working on a History Channel documentary located a previously undiscovered 20-foot section of Challenger's fuselage on the ocean floor near the original impact site. NASA confirmed the section via serial number as part of the left-hand payload bay. The find demonstrated that after 36 years, the Atlantic still holds significant portions of the vehicle. It also renewed calls from aerospace historians and family advocates for a more comprehensive survey of the remaining debris field before natural degradation destroys what is left. 22. The identified remains of Commander Francis Dick Scobie and pilot Michael Smith are interred at Arlington National Cemetery, where a memorial to all 7 crew members was dedicated in 1987. The site draws a consistent stream of visitors. What most of them do not know, what the plaques do not say, is that the 2 men buried there were conscious when they died, that one of their colleagues reached across a disintegrating spacecraft to turn on a breathing pack, and that the full record of their final minutes remains, to this day, classified.